I am so delighted to moderate this conversation today on the future of biodiversity conservation with Laura Martin and Emma Marris, based on their recent books, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, and Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World. Laura Martin is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Williams College. She trained as a wetlands ecologist before becoming a historian and has published widely in ecology, environmental history, and the environmental humanities, as well as writing for Slate, The Washington Post, and the LA Times. Her recent book, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, is a wide-ranging history of attempts to repair and restore wildlife populations, plant communities, and ecosystems in the United States since the late 19th century. Wild by Design presents ecological restoration as a third way of environmental management, one that bridges the divide between the conservation of natural resources primarily for human use and the preservation of wild spaces kept apart from human activity. This is a cautiously optimistic book. It simultaneously critiques how past attempts at ecological restoration have problematically reflected the social beliefs of their times and have often gone hand in hand with harming marginalized people, while also exploring the promise of a future in which people and other species coexist more harmoniously. Since the publication of Wild by Design, Professor Martin has been working on a new book on the global history of hormonal herbicides. Emma Marris is an award-winning journalist and environmental writer. She has written for National Geographic, Wired, The New York Times, Nature, and Outside Magazine, and is the author of two books, Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, which was published in 2011, and Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World, which was published in 2021 and will be available in paperback this coming March. She has described her approach to environmental writing as being more interested in finding and describing solutions than delineating problems, and more interested in joy than despair. In this spirit, Wild Souls asks, what are our ethical obligations to wild animals? Importantly, the book takes us through several ways of thinking about animals as individuals, and not just endangered species, or perhaps more troublingly, invasive ones. Like Wild by Design, Wild Souls invites us to think seriously about the role of humans in helping to bring about the flourishing of non-human life. I cannot recommend strongly enough the impact of reading the two books together. Doing so for me connected the justice implications of grappling with the non-reversible impacts of human history on the non-human world to the philosophical challenges of seeing individual lives in a present global era fixated on institutional management. Though both navigate such complexity with insight and grace, neither book gives us easy answers. Instead, they encourage us to accept that choosing to intervene in biodiversity protection is a deeply ethical, social, and ultimately personal act. Okay, so Laura and Emma, I'm going to ask you a few questions to get us started, and then I'll turn to audience questions about halfway through. So for those of you who have joined us today, please feel free to submit your questions in chat at any point in the conversation. And if you need to, if you have a choice in chat of only being able to chat with one of us, I'm Abby Spinak again. Please send your questions to me directly. Okay, Laura and Emma. I want to start very broadly with the idea of wild or wildness. Both of you use the word wild in your titles, but then you take a much more complex approach to the concept throughout your books, at times discounting the idea altogether, but also offering new conceptions of wildness for your readers. So I want to ask, what has wild come to mean to you? And how would you call on us to reframe our own politics or ethics of wildness? Emma, why don't I ask you to start? You're muted.
There we go. It said the host is not allowing people to unmute themselves. So I was like, oh no. But you can hear me now, right? All right, great. Okay, so this is such a good question. I think it's a great way to set us off. Because I think the reason that we both have this word in our titles is partly because people are so drawn to the idea of the wild. So obviously we want people to be drawn to our books. So that's part of the reason I think that we put it in the title. It's just like such a deeply resonant and exciting word. But what the heck does it mean in a world where human activity is so thoroughly interwoven into all of the ecosystems around us? So I've now written 2 books that kind of grapple with this. Rambunctious Gardens grappled with this on more of a landscape ecology scale, and then Wild Souls on a more of a sort of a what does wildness mean when applied to animals? And I think that we just have to toss out the definition of wildness or wilderness as untouched by humanity. And it's funny, I think that in 2022, that's a less controversial statement than it would have been 5 years ago. I think the culture is starting to move in that direction. And when I say the culture, I mean broadly sort of Western-oriented conservationists, restorationists, landscape designers. I think that a lot of people are challenging this idea that there's such a thing as a purely wild landscape or a purely wild animal that has no influence at all from humanity. I mean, climate change is just the end of that discussion, right? Even a place that's never seen a human is got more carbon. So for a while, I thought that we just had to sort of get rid of the concept altogether, that we just didn't get to have any wildness. And in fact, the subtitle of my first book is called something like Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World or something like that. But I think that we still can have wildness. We just need to define it as a property that hews to the individual organism and that describes its level of autonomy. So they will come in degrees. It's not an on-off switch, but an animal, for example, it's easier for us to imagine with an animal, but this applies to a plant or a fungus as well, is if it has a high level of autonomy, then I think we can call that individual wild. And I think that that kind of wildness, that sort of individual autonomy is still a property that we can see. And I think it's a property that's valuable because that autonomy is part of what it means to flourish for those. It means that they're making choices that they want to make. So that's my working definition at the moment, is sort of individual level autonomy.
So I begin the book Wild by Design with contrasting or pointing out that many of us have deep intuitions of how to care for domesticated companion species. So we provide food and shelter and sometimes even monogrammed sweaters to our pets and those species that we choose to live with. But the question that drew me to design is what does it mean to care for wild species? And it's a question that Emma also asks in her book, and I'm so delighted to be in conversation with Emma today because it's actually her first book, Rambunctious Garden, that first got me questioning some of what I was learning as at the time, a graduate student in ecology, when the idea of novel ecosystems, the idea that there are very few places on Earth today that are untouched by human activity. If we think about climate change, there is no place, no species that is untouched by human activity. And there's this real crisis in ecology and conservation biology that Emma outlines in Rambunctious Garden, that where people were saying, is this the end of conservation, of restoration? What is the way forward for people to try and manage non-human species? If there's no such thing as, if we're defining wildness as apart from human society and economy, as untouched by humans, then perhaps there is no wildness. And I also came to start to think about wildness as something more along the lines of autonomy. And therefore restoration practice as being a collaboration between humans and other species. So I define restoration in Wild by Design as an attempt to collaborate in order to create habitats. between humans and non-humans. And I think thinking about wildness as autonomy or some kind of self-determination for species is a really exciting way to think about wildness that does not depend upon fully separating out human lives from other lives. And I do agree that this was a controversial position even 5 years ago, but there's now a lot of energy within ecology, within landscape architecture, within conservation biology around these ideas of kind of compromising or meeting other species partway.
Or even just the idea that we can be part of nature in a non-negative way. Like, I think that idea, I kind of call it like the braiding sweetgrass effect because of the huge effect of that book on people. I think that the idea that humans can be a part of nature and without destroying it is just like finally getting traction.
Thank you both for those beautiful definitions. And if I can stay on definitions for a minute, I want to kind of push on what you just mentioned about humans being a positive part of nature and preservation and restoration, and turn to the idea of ecosystems and novel ecosystems. So both of you can, much like you have difficult relationships with the world, with the word wild, both of you consider how the concept of ecosystems is a human construct. And you're both troubled by how the history of ecosystem science and management contains quite a lot of human-caused death, among other issues. Yet you both find promise in the idea of novel ecosystems, collaborations of people and the non-human in new configurations that are healthy and flourishing, but without any allegiance to a historical baseline. So I wanted to ask you, just in this last moment of thinking about definitions, what do we gain and lose by thinking with the model of ecosystems? And what are the promises and perils of novel ecosystems, both for understanding change in nature and as an ethical way that humans might intervene? And along with that, have you seen the idea of novel ecosystems applied well in projects of biodiversity management?
Mm-hmm. Laura, do you want to go first with that one?
Yeah, so when I started writing Wild by Design, I was setting out to write a history of ecological restoration as both a scientific discipline and a management practice that is now one of the most widespread, well-funded and kind of dominant management practices worldwide. That wasn't always the case. It's only been the past few decades that restoration has really taken off. And when I set out to research the book and go to the archives of the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, various ecologists who have worked on restoration, I expected to find a deeper history of attempts to return ecosystems to former historical states. So in the 90s and even early 2000s, so much emphasis in restoration was on return, was on the idea that ecosystems could be set back to what they had looked like before humans damaged them. And I found it really interesting and a source of real surprise and hope that for decades prior to the 1980s, 1990s, restorationists really weren't thinking about temporal baselines in restoration. They weren't using the term novel ecosystem, since that's a very recent term, but they were thinking about themselves as embedded in changed environments. And they were looking to restore particular aspects of that environment, whether it be a particular species like the American bison, or a particular aesthetic, like the aesthetic of looking unmanaged. But there wasn't this rigid adherence to a historical ecosystem. And I found that honestly surprised me, because one of my goals in first starting to research the project was to think about what is the history of this kind of timeline-based management.
Yeah, actually, when I read your book, I was surprised by that too. I was also expecting it to go a little bit further back. And I mean, I think that there were some people who thought about it in that way even before it was institutionalized, certainly you quote some people in there who sort of thought about the work of ecosystem management, partly in terms of holding on to a vanishing heritage, right? So there's definitely sort of vibes of wanting to get some of that magic from the past. But you don't, but like you show in the book, it wasn't kind of baked into policy or any of that stuff until quite recently. And I was also surprised by that. Sorry, did I interrupt you? I was just.
Oh, I would just to continue, Abby, with your question. You also noted that both of us think about the kind of constructedness of the ecosystem concept and some of the both biotic and human violence that went into creating the ecosystem concept. So in Wild by Design, I have a chapter on the ways in which our understandings, there's a very kind of influential idea in ecology that species diversity confers resiliency, that ecosystems that have a greater number of species are better able to withstand disturbances, whether that's a hurricane or climate change. And I find in Wild by Design that the history of that concept comes from ecological studies that were funded by the US Atomic Energy Commission, specifically to plan for World War III, to plan for a very human-caused disturbance of nuclear annihilation. And so I think there I'm just really interested in thinking about the ways in which some of these historical injustices shape our scientific theories and also constrain how we view landscapes or think about landscapes, and have kind of locked us into a particular definition of resiliency that is historically contingent and just didn't necessarily have to be where we landed with land management.
Yeah, I would say that for me, there's this sort of like old historical division between people who are more sort of Frederick Clemens kind of thinking of the ecosystems as these sort of natural types, almost organism-like, that go through these predictable stages. And then you have your sort of Gleason fans who see an ecosystem as sort of a temporary set of relationships that hold for a while in sort of geological time, and then some of those components might drift apart and they might drift back together if you're kind of looking at it through the millennia, and that it's not really a clearly bounded object in that same way. And I definitely fall into that second camp. And I don't really think ecosystems are things per se. I think that they are, the idea that we can put a boundary around an ecosystem type is it's a convenient fiction that's been useful in different fields and forestry. And, I've long been sort of fascinated by these extremely detailed taxonomies of ecosystem types that are used in various fields. And forestry is one of the best examples, where they're looking at the exact gradient of the slope and the exact number, the density of all these different tree species. And they'll have like, this is a type 27A, subclass C pine forest. I think it's very human and natural to want to put names to things, partly because we love them, right? Like if we're out in the woods and we see trees and flowers and birds and we know the names of those species, somehow knowing their names makes us feel closer to them. I actually think this is at some level, it's a very kind of a sweet impulse. It's a kind of what we want to have a relationship. And so we want to name. And certainly I'm sure that everybody watching has ecosystems that they themselves are personally have an emotional relationship to, if it's like the rocky kelp beaches of the Pacific Northwest, or if it's your like pinyon pine forests or whatever you've got, you might hold it in your mind as this whole entity with all its component parts. And you probably have a name for it as well that's meaningful to you. But I think that all of those things are in some ways us trying to capture the kind of dynamic flow of biological evolution, which is always happening and always moving around. And they're always variable through time and space. We're trying to capture that magic in a bottle. And at some level, I think it's inevitable that we have to have some sort of scheme for categorizing if we want to do prioritization and so on. But I think this sort of like ultimately, metaphysically almost, I don't think ecosystems are real. Exactly.
I think it begs the question too, what happens if the ecosystem is not the scale that we're trying to restore or conserve on? And I think one thing that I was really thinking about in the juxtaposition of our two recent books is, so I start Wild by Design with an example of George Archibald, who is a scientist that lived with an individual whooping crane for 3 years in order to try and shift her into reproductive status to produce a fertile egg through artificial insemination. Whooping cranes were really catastrophically endangered, and there was very little science on how to breed them captively. And so it's this incredible story of an individual person who cared for an individual organism and spent years living with her and pretending to be her mate even. Archibald says when this whooping crane eventually did lay a viable egg, Archibald said, I feel like the father of that whooping crane. So really thinking about an individual relationship, but then I'm in the book interested in how restoration became so scaled up over time, kind of how it goes from trying to restore single populations of single species to ecosystem management to thinking about carbon offsetting mega plantations and mega wetland restoration projects in the 1990s. And Emma, something that your book pushed me to think about is, what if we put attention back on the individual? What if the question is not how do we restore an entire ecosystem, but how do we treat the black-capped chickadee that visits my backyard, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I could keep going, but I feel like we've got more questions.
Actually, you walked right into my next question.
Great.
Maybe about thinking at those different scales between the individual and species. In particular, because I mean, Emma, for me, that was one of the things that really resonated for me in reading your book too. Coming from the field of environmental planning, I always think in terms of population and species, not in terms of individuals. It's just such a different scale of thinking. And it occurred to me when you were talking about the way that people relate to ecosystems, you mentioned rocks or a particular type of plant. What I think we get this, maybe we think about these landscapes as ecosystems, but when we try to define them, I, like you, tend to gravitate towards individual moments, individuals. And Laura, I'm glad you went to the whooping cranes, because I was going to ask you, the idea of individuals is much less prevalent in your book. And I wanted to ask, I guess, how that tension between individuals and species, what work is that doing for you in thinking about these projects that are aimed so much at thinking of species health as the sort of gold standard for these projects of restoration? And then how do both of you navigate the irreconcilable conflicts that come with thinking about flourishing at those different scales?
All right, who wants to go?
Well, I wanted to point, Emma, to you a quote from Wild Souls, where you write, "The core work of caring is directing energy and matter toward one body, keeping it alive." And I've been thinking about that quote in particular. I'm also teaching right now a course on animals and societies, so animal philosophy is very much on my mind. But this kind of difference in scale in which so much of animal ethics and animal philosophy is focused on individual suffering, or the idea of how to treat an individual in a moral economy, whereas so much of restoration ecology in latter decades has been focused on the collective, either the entire species or the entire ecosystem. And so we can ask what, at what scale in doing this sort of work, this positive work for the environment, are we imagining care operates? What does it mean to care for an entire species, given climate change, versus, and how might that look different? How might someone make a different decision if one is deciding to try and care for an individual, maybe wounded bird, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, when I started Wild Souls with the research for that book, like I was convinced I was going to be able to solve this problem. I was like, I'm sure that if I just get like the right ethical theory, or like I just use my rational inductive logic, like I can bulldoze through this, and there's got to be a way that we can care for individuals and also protect biodiversity and what we call ecosystems and what we call nature and all that stuff. And I tried and I tried and I tried, but I do think that there is a certain level, and you hit on it with that quote, there's a certain level at which like the physics are just unreconcilable, right? Because if you are taking care of an individual, and the real eureka moment for this, for me, was sitting at the table and watching my kids eat. And this in particular, my husband, when my kids were babies and my husband would feed them, he would always open his own mouth, like you go in with the spoon and you're like, because like his little empathy neurons were firing so hard that he would open his own mouth. And I was like, this is what we're doing. We're taking all this energy from all these animals and all these plants coming ultimately from the sun, and we're pouring it into our children. Like that's like the work of care. And then what is an ecosystem? What is nature? It's all that energy running around in this big complicated net. Moving through food webs and going up and down these trophic levels, and things dying and being eaten and rotting and decomposing, and that energy cycles. And you can't do both at the same time. You can't put all of the energy in all of the organisms that live on Earth simultaneously. Like it doesn't math. You have to choose whether you care for the individuals, some individuals over others, or you have to prioritize this flow. And I think when we were talking earlier about what is an ecosystem, how are we defining that? I think that in some ways, one thing that the whole enterprise of conservation and restoration struggles with is that some of the most sort of almost mystical, wonderful things that get people into these fields are described by some of the most boring ass names, like biodiversity and ecosystem function and stuff like that, because we don't have good names for this flow, this sort of movement of energy and nutrients. But that's actually like where the magic is, where the sort of sizzle of nature is. And so I ended up the book just being, having to sort of throw it back into the laps of the readers in some ways, and sort of saying, look, in some cases, I could give you my advice, but you're not going to be able to take care of every organism on the planet at the same time. You're going to have tensions between, and anybody who's ever dealt with a management problem where they have a non-native predator that's eating up local species knows this. Like you're either going to have to kill the non-native introduced predator, or you're going to have to watch your native animals die. And ultimately, there's no way out of that decision.
And I think we maybe see a real mismatch right now in how we conceive of the scale of our biggest environmental problems, like climate change, like non-native invasive species competing with a more desired species. And like that scale of problem, and then the scale upon which care is enacted, which is right, the individual scientist living with, or the individual whooping crane, or observing one population of the species. And I think that mismatch in scale can lead to a real sense of paralysis, or a sense that, I think I do have a lot of students right now who feel that the question of how far to intervene or how much to intervene is so overwhelming that it is an easier ethical decision, or a better or safer ethical decision, to just step back and not do anything and allow the consequences of
nature to take its course,
harm, right, to take its course, and to not intervene further. And I think, But this is where I see ecological restoration as being a really hopeful science and practice and design discipline too, where restorationists are asking these tricky questions of how far to intervene, which species, as Emma pointed out, like, do you decide to kill the non-native species that is perhaps you perceive to be competing with the species that you're trying to protect, right? Like these, restoration is action, it is engaging, it is trying to do something. And I think that both Emma and I frame this in language of care, right? And in terms of care, we're both influenced by some of the same literature coming from feminist philosophy as well, and thinking about what care might mean for non-humans.
Yeah, I have trouble. I mean, in the beginning of your book, you talk about restoration as somehow being a practice that can make amends. And that I struggle with that a little bit, because I'm like, who are we making amends to? It's not these individuals, right? Because usually the harms that have sort of set up the conditions for their lives, they often happened before they were even born, right? Like they've always lived in this weird degraded ecosystem, or if they're gone, they're not here to be harmed. It becomes like difficult to figure out who the justice is owed to when you talk on these sort of ecosystem wide scales. But on the other hand, it's an incredibly common intuition that when we bulldoze an ecosystem, that somehow we need to make amends, or that we have done a wrong that needs to be somehow atoned for.
Yeah, and I think a question that I'm particularly interested in the book is, where can we move beyond the kind of concept or framework of compensation and think about justice and what justice might look like, and what justice might look like, not just for non-humans, but also for humans, because there's been many conservation and restoration projects that have displaced people from their homes, that have caused conservation refugeeism, that have privileged the lives of non-human species over marginalized humans. And so
you're hard on restoration in the book, man. By the time I got to the end, and then you were like, but it's a hopeful practice. I was like, really? Wow. You've listed so many ways in which it seems to have gone off the rails, or like it's not living up to its stated goals. But I think I do agree with you that, like, in an ideal form. And I really like the way that you frame it, as I always thought of restoration as kind of a tool to achieve the goals of either sort of conservation or preservation. But you set it up as a third way, like an alternative to conservation or preservation. And I think that's really interesting. I need to chew on it more, but I think, it has potential. But I still wonder if the name gets in the way so much, because it's got this "re" in the beginning of it. And it really does seem to, I mean, if you use an art analogy or whatever, it does seem to really sort of say, let's roll back changes. Let's like hit that Control-Z key a bunch of times until we're back to some ecosystem we liked better. And if it is, I mean, I actually think that the title of your book would be a worthy replacement, wild design, like designing something that can then have its own autonomy. I don't know. I like the sound of that better. I think it's more accurate.
Yeah. A lot of the alternatives for restoration, the word restoration, and I also have "re" in them too, like rewilding. I've been thinking a lot about rewilding, but again, with that kind of embedded sense of return. And I do think I chose the title, thinking about it. A lot of people have the intuition that a wild landscape or species is the exact opposite of a designed landscape or species. But I think that restorationists have, since the early 1900s, tried to design wildness.
Yeah, no, I think the paradox is inherent to the field. So why not just lean into it?
I wonder if I can turn it around a little while we're on the subject of design, and whether design and wildness are compatible or contradictory, and just sort of in the spirit of moving past damage discourse. I wonder if I can ask you to talk a little bit about learning from the non-human. So Emma, you ask early on in your book, in an exploration of subjective consciousness. What is it like for a bat to be a bat? And you take seriously that it may be impossible for us to fully know. And yet both of you write about extreme measures that humans have undertaken to be like the animals that they're trying to protect. So dressing like a whooping crane, for example, or teaching Elsa the lion to hunt. And in my reading of the way that you describe these programs, they're not, let's say, good science, but they're not just that, but they're another way to look at them might be as humans apprenticing themselves to the animals and their logics. And I'm thinking here, Laura, of how you've called for a definition of restoration as an attempt to co-design nature with non-human collaborators. So I'm wondering, how can we better cultivate the humility and curiosity in ourselves and our institutions to see the non-human as equals, as teachers, and even as designers?
Go ahead, Laura. I have thoughts, but go ahead.
Yeah, in thinking about co-design, was thinking a lot about the scientists and land managers that have such an intimate knowledge of the lives of other species. And the cases that you point to in both of our books actually live with and try and learn the behaviors of other species in order to interact with and study them. But anyone working with plants and animals is learning some of the life ways of those species in order to try and interact with them. And I think the dilemma I do toss this back out to the readers at the end of the book too, because I think the dilemma with co-design is it implies equal power and equal agency. And we live in a world where we at least, I don't think it's always the case, but we perceive humans to have the decision-making power in decisions. And certainly humans have a disproportionate ability to determine which individuals or which species live and which die. And so then there's the risk of co-design kind of making the whole process of restoration or conservation seem apolitical, or to seem that it is just this kind of optimistic, unproblematic meeting of different of humans and other species. And that I don't think is the power dynamic that is ever happening in restoration as it's currently practiced. But I think a thinker that I'm really influenced by here and that writes really compellingly about this meeting of human and non-human minds is Donna Haraway. And she tries to get us to think beyond animals as responsive and toward animals as reciprocating, as being in the idea that human co-inhabitants with other species or observers of other species are entering into an ongoing social relationship with that individual or that species when they are studying them or manipulating them or living with them or engaging them. And that to that she presses us to think about the ways in which when we look at an animal, our gaze is being met by another mind that is also contemplating what we mean socially by our gestures and our gaze and our behavior.
One thing that I've always found so kind of contradictory is that often you'll hear this notion that sort of humans are in charge, or that we're in danger of being in charge, that we'll be managing the whole world, and that if we don't pull back, that if we don't put all of this energy into restraint, that we'll just be kind of like these lords of the planet. But then this is the same group of people that are like super obsessed with invasive species, which like apparently are out of control and we can't stop them, and they're like running amok. And it seems like there's a contradiction there. Like we're saying that these other species are just at our whims, but then we're also saying that other species are like extremely difficult to beat back, and that if you don't catch them early, like they'll just go, there's no hope. So I feel like we have different discourses in how much we do share control, or how much in control we can be. And I wrote a piece for National Geographic about rats, and yes, here we are, the lords and masters of planet Earth, and like, we cannot get rats out of any city. Like, we just cannot do it. They are too, we are not in control of New York City right now as we speak, So I think that there are ways in which this notion that if it's the only thing stopping us from running the world is our humility, I just think it's incorrect factually. Like, I think we're still a long way from being able to have that kind of level of mastery that frightens us, and it should frighten us, And I also think that it's interesting that you say that your students are overwhelmed by the question of how to determine the correct level of intervention, or the ethical level of intervention. And I think that part of that overwhelm might come from this feeling that there has to be one answer that applies to all places and all situations. And of course, that's not true. I think that like a really smart way to do it is to have a bunch of different levels and styles of intervention that are really based on the case. And I think that includes, a good, healthy chunk of land and sea where we're not intervening. Now, obviously we're intervening on a global sense because of climate change and stuff, but where we're not doing sort of active, intentional management, because we will learn so much from those places. Ironically, this argument that went on for decades that we needed to preserve places and do restoration so we could have a control group. Like, I still kind of believe that. I still think it's important to have places that we don't manage so we can see what happens without us fiddling around in there, because we're dumb and we make tons of mistakes. And of course, those places are going to look very weird very quickly. And they're not going to necessarily go in directions that they're certainly not going to look like a vignette of primitive America. But I think that those, they can be incredibly valuable. And we can also get that wildness that we crave from those places.
And I think that that intuition that many diverse approaches and projects toward caring for non-human species and toward restoration is one that I conclude the book with. I have a skepticism of the mega project, whether that's the restoration mega project or the kind of recent, there's so much traction right now in conservation toward the 30 by 30 plan and the half Earth idea, the idea that 50% of Earth's land area should be set aside from human use, and that this is the only way to save biodiversity. And I find much more likely and much more realistic as well the idea that many tiny scale projects that are trying to care for species in different ways is the kind of way forward, and a more effective path.
Although I think there are some restoration projects that are just approaches that are just dumb and we should just stop doing. So we should have a diversity of approaches, except the few approaches that I personally think are dumb.
100%. I wonder if I can turn to the chat now and ask some questions from the audience. At the beginning of the conversation, a couple of people had some trouble wrapping their heads around autonomy from a justice framework. So one person asked, they thought your description of wildness as autonomy was wonderful, but they worried that Western elite humans are wilder than those that are marginalized based on this definition.
Ooh, I like that. I like that question.
And so they are curious about the hierarchy of autonomy. And then someone else followed up on that in the non-human world by asking what kind of autonomy does, say, a wood rat have relative to bobcats and eagles?
Okay, so that first point I think is an excellent one. And I think it goes to support the notion that autonomy is a sort of a morally valuable property, right? Because when we think about humans having different levels of autonomy, we get that feeling that this is not good and this is not right. And I think the questioner is correct. I think that you can buy a lot more freedom. And I think that shows the rottenness of a lot of our social systems. I think it's absolutely correct. There's no true freedom without freedom from want and the ability to have healthcare and basic your needs met. You can't. That's a prerequisite for any kind of individual human freedom. So I think that's the case. And then in the question of sort of relative levels of animal freedom, I really do think that a wood rat probably has more autonomy than what were the two examples? A bald eagle and what was the other one? A bobcat. Those ones, actually, those are interesting. Those, I think probably all three of those in the North America now that eagles are off the endangered species list and are not so intensively managed, have probably quite high levels of autonomy. It's often the species that are being intensively managed, a whooping crane that's living under wire, like a California condor that's at the zoo, or a wolf that has a radio collar around its neck and gets shot if it eats too many calves. Those are the wild animals that have lower levels of autonomy. It's the New York rat that probably has the highest level of autonomy of it all, because even if we want it dead, we can't manage it.
And I think that a lot of people trying to cultivate or care for wildness, right, are trying to get an individual or a species to the point where they are able to determine their own habitat, where to go, and to choose who to mate with, right? This idea of choice, it's of course an imposition of particular cultural values and valuing freedom, valuing autonomy. And maybe it could be argued that this is it's certainly a thorny area in animal philosophy to think about imagining that other species have this same desire for autonomy that people situated in particular cultures and time have. But I also think that and I think too, I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which autonomy, I land on the term autonomy in the book, but I am unsatisfied with it in some way, because there's so much compelling writing that pushes against the idea that anything or anyone is autonomous in any way.
Sure.
Right, this idea that we live in a fully symbiotic world in which everyone and everything is dependent on everything else. And so, but I do think there is a middle ground where rather than kind of rejecting everything about the vision of wildness as the ability to make decisions about one's life way. I think autonomy is maybe how we're each using it is kind of thinking about it in contrast to how to put this exactly, the idea that a species is fully independent from intervention or impact, like autonomy rather than untouchedness or pristineness.
Well, one way to think about it too is like the genetic angle, right? So you could have wildness is often thought to be something that you can spoil by like hybridizing with the domestic. So if you're a bison and you have cattle genes, some people think that you're less wild. But under our definition, as long as you decide where to go all day, you're just as wild, whether you're a cow or a bison, honestly. And I think the question about whether animals. Oh, did you just lose your light?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, while she turns the light back on, I will say I think that there's compelling evidence that animals value autonomy insofar as they have choices that they want to make, and that if you thwart those choices, they will be pissed off. And a lot of the research that I did for the book about zoos really convinced me that all sorts of different species and all different sorts of different taxa, that if you try to keep them in a box or make them do stuff they want to do or make them mate with somebody they don't want to mate with, like, they will chafe at that. They are not just little robots. In fact, there was just a paper that came out this week about Hawaiian songbirds. And they were like, we found out that if we paired them with birds that they liked, they had more offspring. And I was like, you think, like you put them with, like this idea, this was like hot news that if you put the birds with other birds that they actually get along with, they might actually mate with them. So I think that, the fact that animals and plants also make choices, right? Like plants decide which way to grow based and where to put their leaves and how to orient them towards the sun and how to grow their roots. So choices are being made all day, every day by these organisms.
I just want to stay on this question for one more minute because I'm realizing that someone else asked a similar question to the one about human autonomy, specifically in the context of Indigenous peoples and the particularly violent history of how they have lost autonomy in the name of nature preservation, conservation, and restoration. And so I want to take that question as a way to ask you both about how you end both of your books with calls for environmental and climate justice, and ask if you can talk a little bit about whether that framework helps to navigate some of these more thorny questions, and what specifically you're calling for when you're asking for Laura, for you specifically talk about environmental justice, and not just distributive, but procedural justice. And Emma, you particularly call for people to think about how they can connect to climate justice movements individually and personally. So I was hoping that you could say a couple more words about that framework as a sort of not perfect, but productive conclusion.
Yeah, so one of the arguments I make early in the book is that the origins of the restoration movement in the United States share roots with white supremacy and white settler colonialism. That the first 5 sites that became what today is the U.S. National Wildlife Refuge were lands that were appropriated from Indian reservations under the Dawes Act. And that it was rich white eugenicist men in the early 1900s that argued that existing reservation land should be dispossessed, should be taken from tribes and tribal control and put toward bison growing instead, for the sole purpose, they were not thinking about, they were specifically thinking about access to bison for white hunters and white tourists. And so I think I start the book with this story in part because it is important to understand the history of in the United States, our most important restoration site system. And to recognize too that some of, bison, when bison restoration is described, it's often described as this unmitigated, this unproblematic success story, that it is one species that was really imperiled by federal efforts to eradicate bison in order to force Native Americans into the reservation system. But that the restoration itself was also a perpetuation of that injustice. And so I end the book thinking about what we can learn from environmental justice activists and scholars about not, as you said, not just distributive justice, how are environmental harms and benefits distributed among people, but also procedural justice, who gets to make decisions about where, in this case, where an environmental benefit happens, where environmental restoration happens. I mean, I see real potential for further alignment between biodiversity restoration, the biodiversity restoration movement, and social justice movements, where we should be thinking about, in any restoration or conservation project, who is being asked to and empowered to make decisions about the landscape and about other species.
Yeah, you had this line right at near the end of your book about how it's a lot easier to plant a pretty garden with plants that were here in 1492 than it is to actually address the ongoing harms of colonialism. And I was just like, ow, like it's just really struck true that in some ways, I think that sometimes some of this busy activity, removing non-natives and doing restoration activity can be, a way to feel good about how we're interacting with the land without digging deep and fixing some of the structural stuff, the social stuff. And honestly, after reading the history that you lay out, sometimes you'll have the Fish and Wildlife shooting some species, and then 20 years later, they're trying to save it. And, the philosophy changes all the time, and all these different land management agencies have different rules and regulations and and yet, we seem to have muddled along. There have been serious losses along the way, but at the same time, there's still a lot left to preserve. I almost feel like, you have a list of things that we need to do as well as restoration, or almost as a prerequisite for restoration, things like dealing with racism and colonialism and fossil fuel extraction and burning. And I mean, I almost feel like we know those are terrible things that we need to work on. And we largely know, especially in the case of fossil fuels, we know what to do, which is stop taking it out of the ground and stop burning it. And I think that the fine details of how to go about ecological restoration can be worked out along the way in all these different kind of experimental ways, with like very deep procedural equity in terms of who gets to decide and how we do it. But I almost feel like, do I dare say that maybe some of this justice stuff is more urgent than doing ecological restoration? I'm not sure if I want to go that far, but after reading your book, that was almost how I felt.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I would argue by both of your definitions that it's not unrelated, that doing the justice work would in some ways, not naturally, but it would lead to forms of ecological justice also.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, and I've been reporting a lot recently on tribal land management projects, which are popping up more and more, especially up in Canada, and a lot of them are really exciting, and they can be ways to sort of serve the cause of honoring treaties and restoring sovereignty, and at the same time, new perspectives and new ways of doing conservation on the land, often that are informed by a much deeper knowledge base than what the agencies have been screwing around with for the past couple hundred years.
We are getting right up to the end of the hour. There are still a number of really interesting questions in the chat. And so what I'm going to do is copy and email them to both of you.
Great. Thank you.
And then maybe you can continue those conversations offline. But I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for being here and for such a generative conversation.
Yeah, thanks. This has been great. Everyone go out and buy both our books immediately. They make great Christmas gifts.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you everyone for logging on tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.